Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Tuesday, September the 2nd, 2025. We're living in turbulent times, particularly in the universities. Wall Street Journal reported last week that Donald Trump's next fight is with the universities. He seems to be fighting with them ever since he came back to power. They seem to epitomize, at least in his mind, everything that's wrong with America. And more people are trying to figure out how to save the American university, although most of them don't tend to be insiders, certainly as insidery as my guest today, who has a new book out today. It's called Peril and Promise, College Leadership in Turbulent Times, and it's written by my guest, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who has run two colleges, Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts and Spelman College in Georgia. Welcome and congratulations, Dr. Tatum, Beverly, for your new book.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on your program.
Yeah, I'm a little in awe of all these PhDs, Beverly. Your PhD is noted on the title, although more and more people are beginning to suggest that those kind of terms aren't necessarily particularly valuable in the 21st century. Do you think being a doctor, having a PhD, tells us anything about people's wisdom these days?
Well, it certainly tells you they've spent a lot of time in school. And certainly, as someone who's been in academia my entire career, I think it matters to acknowledge the fact that people have the persistence to get the degree. That said, there's a lot of wisdom in other communities as well.
Persistence. How long did it take you to get your PhD?
Well, I started my college. I entered college in 1971. I graduated from college in 1975. And then I entered my graduate program in 1975, the fall of 75, and worked on it till I got married in 1979 and left Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, eventually finishing my degree in 1984. So I worked on it pretty steadily for 4 years, and then life intervened. But I'm happy to say I finished it.
I wonder if academia these days is a kind of form of clerisy, that it's a club, an anointed club. Do you think there's something in that?
I don't know that I would describe it in that way. I think access to higher education, whether you're talking about graduate school education or undergraduate education, is an opportunity for young people and older people too, because a lot of our students today are not right out of high school. They're coming back later in life. It's an opportunity to really define what's important to you, not only what you want to study and what you want to do after graduation, but also learn more about the world you live in and the people with whom you will be living, engaging with people different from yourself. There's a lot to be gained in higher education that is hard to find in other places. The military is one place where you can certainly learn a lot about other people whose backgrounds are different from your own. But I think higher education in the United States is a uniquely important opportunity for young people to really develop themselves and become the leaders we need them to be.
Speaking of leadership, the subtitle of your new book, Peril and Promise, is College Leadership in Turbulent Times. The T word, turbulent, is often used. It's used historically. Everyone always seems to think they're living in turbulent times, although, as I noted in the introduction, it seems to be a particularly turbulent time in universities in this second Trump administration. You ran a couple of universities, maybe more than two. I know Spelman and
Those two, yep, Mount Holyoke
Mount
College
Holyoke, two
and
very
Spelman.
very distinguished. They're both women's colleges. Is that right?
Yes, yes, that is
Spelman, and
correct.
I know Mount Holyoke is in Massachusetts. Are you haven't been in the business of college leadership for a while, Beverly? Do you miss it, or are you actually rather happy that in these turbulent times you have the opportunity to sit in a library and write books instead of running colleges?
I have to say there's something very satisfying to be able to be an informed observer and comment on it, as I have spent the time writing this book. But when I served as president at Spelman College for 13 years, as you said, I left that position in 2015, which was 10 years ago. However, I then came out of retirement, if I could use that phrase, and served as interim president at Mount Holyoke for a year in 2022 to 2023. And it was interesting to me, to having had that time away from college leadership, to return to it and recognize how some things had changed. Some things, of course, are perennial in the life of a college president: the need to try to balance budgets, to recruit talented faculty, to find financial aid for students. But coming on the heels of the pandemic, recognizing the isolation that many people had experienced, the loneliness epidemic that is fueling the mental health crisis on college campuses, the concerns about escalating costs, and also the political polarization that is part of today's landscape has only intensified since then. So I am grateful to those who want to lead, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a commentator rather than actually sitting in that hot seat.
You noted earlier that I think you said you began grad school in 1971. Is that right?
No, I was an undergraduate. I started my college experience in 1971.
So
And then
you
I
went to
started
college
graduate school
on
in
the back of
75.
a particularly turbulent time in American history:
Yes.
Vietnam, various kinds of assassinations, just before Watergate. I don't want to blame your publisher. I'm not sure who came up with the subtitle of the book, but
I did.
did you?
So
But
yes, I will claim it. It
well,
was
the
my
subtitle.
title.
So it is. So, for example, is 2025 more turbulent than 1971 or 1968 or 1975, or for that matter, 2001? Are we
I
living
would
in?
say it is. If you'd asked me, is 2022 more turbulent? Maybe not. But in 2025, I think is especially turbulent because of the political climate. We are living in a time when the government is choosing to intervene in the operations of colleges. Some might say holding them hostage for transgressions. The elite institutions, the most elite, the Ivies, are being asked to pay millions and millions of dollars for things that they may or may not have done incorrectly. The challenge to academic freedom that and free speech on campus that has been so much in the news in the last year or two is really, I think, more intense than I've experienced, certainly in my decades of higher education.
You, I'm sure, have been watching very closely the experiences of your fellow college leaders in the face of particularly this new Trump administration at Princeton, Columbia in particular, Harvard, MIT, the UC system. How do you think broadly college leaders, particularly at the Ivies, are dealing with these turbulent times? Are you impressed or rather disappointed?
I want to say right at the top that it is easy to be what I call an armchair quarterback, right? It's easy to say, oh, they should have done this, or they should have done that, or I would have done this, or I would have done that. And the reason I say that from the beginning is because there's always more to the story than we can know. We could say, oh, well, they should have held their ground and not given in. And yet, I read an article about Columbia, for example, where they talked about all the faculty that they were losing, the researchers whose grants were being cut, who were being picked off by other institutions. That's hard to recover from. They felt a need to do what they could do to stop the bleeding, so to speak. And I can certainly understand why they might have chosen to do that. I will, however, say that when Harvard said they were going to fight back in court and to defend themselves against the accusations that had been leveled against them, I thought that was the choice I would have wanted to make.
In other words, go to war rather than try to make peace with someone who doesn't seem very interested in peace. One of the headlines from last week, as I said, is that Trump's next fight with the universities is about racial proxies. You ran an African-American, historically African-American women's college, Spelman, so you're all too familiar with the issue of race in college. There's also the issue, of course, of anti-Semitism and this whole woke debate. Is this central, do you think, Beverly, to our turbulent times?
Well, what's interesting about this particular issue, looking at that headline where it says Trump, is challenging quote, racial proxies in admissions, is interesting because, as we know, the Supreme Court ruled that affirmative action was no longer an acceptable option for institutions. Race-based admissions were no longer considered constitutional. And institutions that were still using them, and not everyone was, but certainly among the elites, the programs that they had in place had to be discontinued. And it was very interesting for people who are observers of this process to watch to see what difference would it make in the year following that decision. Would there be a major shift in the racial makeup of the class at Harvard or Yale or Princeton, et cetera? And what happened actually was that at some institutions, they did see a decline, for example, in the number of Black students who enrolled, but and an increase in the number of Asian students that enrolled. But that wasn't true everywhere. In some places, the numbers didn't shift as much as the spectators had predicted. So the question is, and some people said, well, the numbers didn't change that much. They must be cheating. They must be using, quote, racial proxies. And so now the federal government is saying, we want to see your data. We want to count. We want to, see how you're making your decisions. And what I find very interesting about this is the assumption that you can't get a diverse group of students enrolled unless somehow you're doing something wrong. There is a lot of talent in the higher ed community, in the pipeline of students coming forward. And so for a government that says we should not be talking about race, we should not be race conscious, to suddenly say, we want to count all your groups to see how that's going, seems quite contradictory.
Yeah, you use your words carefully. I think your use of the word contradictory and particularly interesting, perhaps if we were talking offline, you would use stronger language.
Hypocritical, maybe. How about that?
Well, yeah, or perhaps even worse. I'm not necessarily in disagreement with you. Do you think it's the job of a college leader? You've done the job, so this isn't an abstract question. Mm-hmm. To be in the business of social engineering America, of, for example, trying to make a diverse community so that America itself will become more diverse, more equal, maybe strengthening the American dream? Or is that outside the remit of the business of being a college leader?
I think it's an interesting question, and in some ways it kind of depends on the institution. And what do I mean by that? There are lots of colleges and universities that admit almost all of the students who apply. They're not particularly selective. A lot of them are serving communities that have very limited choices in terms of higher education. Maybe it's the local community college or the local state university that's regional. Maybe, if you live in Massachusetts, maybe you've never heard of that college in Minnesota or Iowa or wherever it happens to be. But the people who live in that community are very much dependent on that institution for employment, for cultural activities, for the opportunity that those institutions provide. And when we talk about some of these issues, I think we are often talking about them as they relate to Harvard and Yale and Columbia, which is a very tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of where students go to college, right? But having said that, we also know that those Ivies produce many of the leaders in our nation, in Congress, in the courts, in the hospitals. There is um, a very heavy contribution to historically to national leadership coming out of those institutions. If we rewind back to the 90s, the book The Shape of the River, written by William Bowen and Derek Bach, argued that it was the responsibility of these elite institutions to contribute broadly to a diverse group of leaders, and that, in fact, they set out to do so because they recognized it as a responsibility for those particular institutions. And I think that was perfectly reasonable on their part. It wasn't that they didn't find talented people everywhere. And so when they made an intention to expand the diversity of their enrollment, what they found when they went back to look at 25 years of data was that the people that they had admitted had done exactly what they intended them to do, gone into the world and become leaders, corporate leaders, civic leaders. And because they have so many applicants, Harvard accepts 2% or something like that, less than 5% of those who apply. They have the opportunity to really construct the class in the way that they think will be most mission centered. And I think that is their right to do that. That's part of academic freedom, to construct your class and decide how you want it to look, recognizing that you don't want 1,500 flute players. You need some drummers, you need some saxophonists. If you think about the analogy of an orchestra, you need people who bring lots of different talents to the table in order to create the best learning environment you can have.
So I'm taking that as a yes. You do think that college leaders can sometimes at least have the right to socially engineer. Before we went live, Beverly, we had a chat about Mount Holyoke. You ran it for a year. It's your last job. I mentioned that my daughter almost went there. In the end, she ended up at Bryn Mawr. One of my takeaways from her experience there was she always spoke very disdainfully, I thought rather cruelly in some ways. I hope she isn't listening to this, about what she called legacy students. What's your take on the legacy issue? I know recently Stanford has announced that they're maintaining their legacy admissions. Did you have to deal with this? And in these turbulent times where everyone's trying to reinterpret and re-engineer democracy, do you think one of the perhaps responsibilities of college leaders is to do away with legacy and make it fair for everyone, and not just the sons or daughters of people who had gone to the college in the past and perhaps even more troublingly had given lots of money to it?
I think more and more institutions are looking at their policies as it relates to legacies. And I have a lot of respect for those institutions that have decided to not have those programs in place. I'm a Wesleyan alum. Wesleyan University is where I went to my undergraduate, where I got my undergraduate education. And Wesleyan is one of those schools that says we are not going to give advantage to the children of our alums because we don't want to be perceived as being unfair. When people talk about affirmative action, what they say, what someone like Donald Trump might say, is that we want merit-based admissions. Admit people on the basis of their merit, assuming that when we take affirmative action into consideration, we're not admitting people on the basis of merit. I would argue that that merit is always operating. But having said that, we do know, based on a very extensive study that was done by a group of economists at Harvard, that if you are an athlete or a legacy, meaning, someone in your family went before, or if you come from a family that is wealthy enough to make a generous donation, or if you are a child of a faculty member or staff member, athletes legacy dean's list, meaning donors, and children, they call them ALDCs. If you fall into one of those categories, your chances of being accepted far outweighs any other advantage that some other group might have. And in fact, that the number of ALDCs admitted at Harvard far exceeds the number of students of color collectively. So we know that those athletes, those legacies, athletes, let me just say a word about that. People often think, well, athletes, surely they mean, that talented Black basketball player from Harlem or something. But in fact, what we know is that athletes who are getting athletic scholarships are often from affluent families, because affluent families have the resources to provide the experiences, the travel, the coaching that leads to that kind of talent development. So all of those categories are associated with income, and with income being perhaps a proxy for race, being white. And so I think it is important to be fair across the board.
Yeah, I've heard some people argue that there's more and more pressure now to get rid of legacy admissions now that there have been a couple of generations of more diverse students. Have you heard that argument, that somehow it's maybe white reactionaries now who have turned against legacy in the face of the multicultural nature of the university?
I have heard what I'll tell you as sort of a different take on what you've just asked me. I had a conversation with a Black woman who attended an Ivy League school, and she said, now that my kids are getting to be college age, they want to get rid of the legacy program. And she took it personally, in a sense, because she said, now my children have this advantage of being legacies, and the legacy program might be going away. She was concerned about that. But having said that, I do think that legacy programs still are much more likely to benefit white students than any other group, because of the long history of educational advantage that has been built into our educational system. Yes, it is true that there are more college-educated African Americans, for example, today. When I went to college in 1971, only 4% of Black adults had a college education. Today, that number is more like 25%, or a little north of that. That's an improvement for sure, but still much smaller than the larger college-going population. So I think if people perceive that legacies are going to benefit that generation of multicultural or multiracial community, I think it's still a very small number, percentage by percentage.
Beverly, as someone who came to the US for grad school, I went to undergraduate in Europe. I've always been shocked, I think is the right word, by the amount of resources and attention invested in college sports. You talked about legacy and sports, and I take your point on that. But what's your take? And this is another area where I think being a college leader now is very turbulent. What's your take on the role of sports in colleges? I always thought that going to university meant learning, going to the library, understanding a subject, and then graduating and going out into the world. The sports can or should have to do with the college experience?
Well, as you might know, one of the things I write in my book about is the decision I made when I was at Spelman to discontinue our participation in NCAA intercollegiate sports. Now, Spelman is a women's college, as you pointed out, and we were participating at Division III. We were not a Division I football school like Michigan or Ohio State or any of the Big Ten schools. And our students Some were interested in playing intercollegiate sports, but it was a very small percentage of the student population who did. So when I was faced with a choice to either invest more heavily in our athletic program because of some changes in our conference, our athletic conference, or withdraw altogether, I decided we should withdraw altogether and use the money we were spending on participation to really invest in wellness for all, particularly for our student population, which was young Black women who the data showed were living sedentary lives, not getting enough exercise, not engaging in physical activity, and as a result, at greater risk at a young age for some of the lifestyle related illnesses like diabetes, high blood pressure, etc. And so it seemed like an opportunity to not only help students develop habits of the mind, but also develop habits of the body in terms of fitness and engaging in the kinds of wellness activities they would have access to as career women living their lives wherever they happen to be. So, for that reason, it made sense to us to get out of the business of college sports. However, I also know that some places, I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, on a Saturday afternoon, everybody in town is heading to the football game because it's so much a part of the culture and the university's experience. And for some institutions, it's a source of revenue. But for a lot of institutions, particularly if they're not competing at the very highest level, it's an expense that is a drain on the institution. And I think more institutions ought to think about what we did, which is invest in wellness activities, the kinds of activities that can be maintained for a lifetime, not just a continuation of high school sport activity.
Speaking of investing, Beverly, I take your point and I agree with you in terms, and I admire you for doing away with formal sports at Spelman. But I wonder, again, and this is not really the issue this is not the point of my question. I wonder whether that kind of thinking might result, at least in some colleges, in another kind of investment in incredibly expensive, sophisticated gyms, when in fact kids who go to these schools could join their local gym for $50 a month, and that would be sufficient. My question really is about the cost of college and the kind of resources and investment that many colleges seem to be making, everything from luxury dorms to high-end gyms to the quality of the food. When I was taking my kids around college a few years ago when they were choosing where to go, there seemed to be this war about the quality of the food, which always seems absurd to me. There's more and more pushback from parents like myself about how much they have to pay. I think it's up to $80,000 or $100,000 a year for high quality education at places like Mount Holyoke and Spelman. From a college leadership point of view, do you think it's, in these turbulent times, is it the responsibility, not so much moral, but in terms of the long-term viability of American college, is it your responsibility to actually not just even cap costs and control them, but actually bring them down so that parents don't have to spend $300,000 or $400,000 for their kids to get a 4-year degree?
Well, the first thing I want to say, just for the point of clarity, Spelman College, while it is an excellent institution, is about 2/3 the cost of a school like Mount Holyoke or some of the other Ivies. And there's a very specific reason for that, because Spelman is serving the needs historically of the African American community, and knowing the differential in terms of family income and resources, it's clearly not going to be an $80,000 ticket, at least not for a while, because we are trying, certainly when I was president and still trying to remain affordable, or as affordable as can be. But I came to Spelman from an institution. I came to Spelman from Mount Holyoke. I worked at Mount Holyoke for 13 years, and then I became president of Spelman. And one of the things I noticed was that Spelman cost significantly less than Mount Holyoke did, but was trying to deliver a quality education in much the same way that Mount Holyoke was. And how was that possible? I thought to myself, how is it possible for us to deliver the same thing that we're trying to do at Mount Holyoke and yet charging a third less? And the answer to that question was to do more with fewer people, because the main cost for any institution is the number of employees. So I will use as an example the Career Center at Mount Holyoke when I was working there back in the early 2000s. There were 11 staff members in the Career Center serving the needs of a population of about 2,000 students. I came to Spelman, from Mount Holyoke, where we were also serving the needs of a population of about 2,000 students. And the Career Center had a staff less than half the size of the Mount Holyoke staff, but still trying to deliver the same kinds of excellent service to students who needed to find jobs as they were graduating, et cetera. So I say this to say HBCUs have a long history of doing more with less. But generally speaking, higher education is very labor intensive. You spend most of your money on faculty and staff salaries. And of course, you also spend money on your physical plant, your buildings, et cetera. And we can point to examples of institutions that have made what seem to me poor decisions around luxury items. The classic build a climbing wall, the rock wall that, everyone talks to, or the lazy river around the campus. There's an example in my book about an institution that put in a man-made lake trying to improve the appearance of the campus, I guess, but ultimately going out of business because they took on way too much debt to do so. So we know that thinking strategically about how you're using your resources and what is going to help you deliver the best education you can for your students in an as efficient way as possible is something that we all have to think about. Because I know, and certainly you do, that most people cannot pay $80,000 a year or $100,000 a year for their student to go anywhere. But having said that, we also know that most of those big ticket prices are not being paid in full, because most of the students at those very expensive schools are also getting a great deal of financial aid. So the ultimate cost is going to be less. But still, we live in a time when we have to think about how can we deliver the benefits of a college education most efficiently to students who have limited resources. That was my number one concern when I was president, wanting to be sure that anyone who started at Spelman was going to be able to finish and not be overburdened by debt and or have to drop out for financial reasons.
You noted that a lot of the cost at colleges is labor, the cost of paying both people like yourself, its leaders, its bureaucrats, as well as its faculty. The new thing, of course, in our turbulent age is AI.
Yes.
An old friend of mine, Clay Shirky, had a piece last week in the New York Times about the way to address the supposed AI cheating crisis in college, which is, of course, an important issue.
Mm-hmm.
But can AI help in terms of the costs? Can it reduce faculty, staff? Can it actually make college education more affordable and indeed more useful in the 21st century?
I think that there are certainly going to be some cost savings associated with artificial intelligence once we learn how to really harness it. And what I mean by that is, while we're learning, we have to invest dollars to make that happen, right? So if we're using AI, we probably need to make an investment in our IT infrastructure. That's a cost. While faculty and staff are learning how to use those resources, how to use AI in a way that is efficient and enhances the delivery of the education. The training is a cost. So there's some startup costs. Maybe that's how I should say it. There's some startup costs. But there's some interesting examples that we see of faculty, for example, using AI to tutor. There's an example that I came across when I was working on my book of a physics professor who basically trained a physics AI tutor, and he divided his class in half. Some of them coming to class and taking notes and being taught in the traditional way, and the other half of the class um, getting their support, their tutorials from his AI instructor, um, his teaching assistant, let's call it, the AI teaching assistant. And the students who worked with the AI teaching assistant actually did better than the students who did not have access to the AI teaching assistant, because they could call on that teaching assistant and ask questions in the middle of the night. They could ask the same question over and over again until they understood it without feeling like they were irritating their instructor. There was an enhancement of the learning experience that AI provided. Now, that same faculty member might have had at another time a graduate student TA who was being paid and who also was not available any hour, but who was working with students. And I'm sure there will be a loss in graduate student positions because of that kind of AI availability. But that said, I don't think I don't think that we can assume that it's all cost savings. I think it's important to acknowledge that there's some expense involved in the use of AI that is yet to be determined. We're still learning about it.
We certainly are. Finally, you're the author of a 2017 bestseller, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? That was written as an authority on the psychology of racism. But this new book isn't on racism. It's about the perils and promise of college leadership in turbulent times. When you look back at your career, Beverly, what are you most proud of as a college leader? And what do you most regret?
I can't say that I have regrets, which
No
is not to
mistakes
say,
at all?
no, that's not what I mean. I just think, not that I was perfect. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that I learned a lot in my role as college president. I learned a lot as a professor. And I have been living in academic communities almost my entire life. My father was a college professor. I grew up in the shadow of a college campus. So all of this is to say there is much about academic communities that I really value, and I am tremendously grateful for having had the opportunity to be in one or other, that whether it was Spelman or Mount Holyoke or the place where I grew up, all of that has been a benefit to me. I have no regrets about that. That's not to say I didn't make any mistakes. But one of the things that I think one of the things that I deeply believe is that none of us has success alone. We are dependent on the people around us, the teams we build, the communities we're part of, and recognizing that the value of what other people have to contribute and being willing to listen carefully and to engage with them is what I have found to be most rewarding about the experience.
As I think another Wesleyan graduate said, or maybe I can't remember where she went to school, it takes a village, right, Beverly?
Yes. Well, I can tell you where she went to school. That was Marion Wright Edelman, and she went to Spelman.
Good. Well, lovely to have you on the show. Congratulations on the new book, Wise Words from a Wise Woman, Beverly Daniel Tatum, PhD. It's a new book out, Peril and Promise, College Leadership in Turbulent Times. She's been a college leader at Mount Holyoke and at Spelman for a long time, so she has much to say. Good luck with the book, Beverly. Honored to talk to you. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.